"You're not on the deed anymore," my brother said, standing in the doorway like he was announcing the weather. Not with cruelty, worse, with convenience. As if what he'd done to me wasn't personal, wasn't cruel, wasn't a betrayal that would leave a permanent burn on my skin. I had only just taken my coat off. The funeral hadn't been more than 3 hours ago. Our father's ashes were still warm in the brass urn on the mantel, and there he was, tossing my place in this house into the trash like an expired receipt. "I figured it was easier this way," he added. "For everyone, everyone. It always means everyone but me." I didn't speak. I couldn't. I felt my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth, dry as plaster. My hand was still on the banister where I used to sit, as a child legs, dangling, watching my father shave before work. Now my body refused to move, as if the wood beneath my palm was the only thing left connecting me to this place. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to walk in, as if I were a guest, a visitor. The living room was dim curtains, still drawn from earlier that morning. The smell of lilies and cold pork filled the space. I caught sight of the dining table, where a few of our cousins sat murmuring, pretending not to look at us. One of them had clearly overheard. I saw the way her jaw tensed, how she suddenly became very interested in rearranging the cheese plate. No one said anything. I looked back at my brother, gray at the temples, now a soft gut pressing against his pressed shirt. He was trying to smile, like he thought this was civil, like this was grown up. "I'll help you pack if you need," he offered. That's when I realized I'd been erased. I'd come here for closure, for peace, maybe to stay a few nights. I'd brought my suitcase in the trunk, and the key I still carried on my ring, the one I'd used since I was 19. And now I was being told by my own blood that I no longer had any claim to the floor beneath my feet. "I don't need help," I said. Finally, my voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone in another room, another body. "Right," he said, shifting awkwardly. "Well, let me know when you're done. I have a call." And just like that, he walked away. Not another word, not a flicker of remorse, just his shoes on the hardwood floor creaking as he disappeared toward Dad's old study, the one he claimed for himself before the last handful of dirt had even hit the grave. I stood there for a long time, coat still in my hand, my bones hollowed out like the house itself. That's the thing about betrayal. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's handed to you in a hallway in polite language with a smile. Sometimes it's just a sentence that changes everything. When I was 19, I declined the scholarship to Boston. It wasn't a glamorous decision. It was made at a kitchen table with chipped enamel in a house that smelled like burnt toast and Vicks. Our mother had just come home from the hospital, pale and hollow-eyed, her hair already thinning at the crown. The word terminal sat between us unspoken but undeniable. My father was never built for caregiving. He was a man of industry, loud with strangers, quiet with us. He folded into himself when she got sick. It wasn't his fault, not entirely. Some men are only taught to lift things, not people. And my brother, he was already gone, off chasing degrees, internships, big city internships that turned into New York suits and conference rooms. I remember his voice on the phone, distant even when it tried to sound warm. "I'd come home if I could," he said once. But this internship could turn into a real position. I never blamed him, not then. So I stayed. I got a job as a receptionist at a dental clinic 2 towns over. The hours were long, and the doctor liked to yell, but the checks cleared. I bathed Mom every night, rubbed her feet, learned how to change sheets without waking her. I gave her my 20s, 1 year at a time, like coins at a toll booth. I'd come home, peel off the synthetic-smelling scrubs, and sit with her in silence. Some nights, she'd cry quietly into the pillow. Other nights, she'd ask me if I was angry. "No, Mama," I'd say, brushing her hair back. "I'm exactly where I should be." That was true then. I believed in duty, in family, in showing up when it was hard, not just when it was easy. Dad watched us from a distance, always carrying the weight of it in his posture. But sometimes late at night, I'd hear him stop outside her bedroom door. Just stand there. The wood creaked under his feet. He'd never come in. He didn't know how, but he never walked away either. When she passed, I stayed longer. I took over the garden she'd started before the diagnosis. I kept the roses alive. I painted the porch. When Dad tripped on the back steps, it was me who took him to every doctor's appointment. I learned about his medications, set alarms. He called me my shadow. He said it fondly. He also said more than once, "This house will always be your home." I think he needed to believe that everything I'd given wasn't going to be forgotten, that there would be some kind of permanence left after all the decay. But love, I've learned, doesn't always translate into ink on paper, not in court, not in the eyes of the ones who weren't watching while I folded old bedsheets and read pharmacy printouts by microwave light. Still, I believed him. When he got sicker years later, I moved back in full time. My brother visited 3 times, each shorter than the last. I never asked why. I didn't want to hear what excuses he'd sewn together. It was in those last years that Dad started calling me his compass. I'd walk into the room and he'd say, "Ah, now I know where I am." It broke something inside me in the best and worst way. We never talked about the deed. I didn't need to, or maybe I was afraid to. Some things feel too sacred to reduce to paperwork, and I never imagined he'd let someone take it away, especially not the person who used to call me sis, with chocolate on his hands, running barefoot through the backyard we both once believed was ours. It was subtle at first, the kinds of changes you only notice when you've memorized the sound of a home. The shuffle of mail moved from one drawer to another, the absence of a familiar folder on Dad's bookshelf, the one with our family documents clipped together with a faded binoclip, and Dad's neat, slanted handwriting on each label. Then the way my brother would walk around the house like it was already his. After Mom died, Dad became quiet in a way that felt different. Not just grief, something more fragile. I'd find him staring at the window, in the morning's coffee-untouched eyes, a little glassy. I thought it was loss, but now I wonder if it was guilt. I started to notice envelopes left unopened on his desk, letters with legal headers, fine print things he used to read, cover to cover. I'd pick them up gently, planning to sort them later, only to find them gone the next day. Once I walked in on my brother, sifting through Dad's drawer, the deep one that stuck a little on the right side. He looked up startled and then smiled like a politician. "Just helping organize some paperwork," he said. "Dad asked me to." I didn't question him then. I wanted to believe that he was finally stepping up, that maybe, after all this time, he'd realized Dad wasn't immortal and needed help, that we were on the same side, that blood still meant something. But then came the silences. Dad stopped asking for me. Meals together became rare. When I brought in his lunch tray, he barely looked at me. It wasn't coldness. It was more like distance, like he had drifted just far enough to not feel safe speaking, or maybe someone had made him feel like he shouldn't. My brother's visits became more frequent, more polished. He'd arrive with store-bought muffins and handshakes for the nurses. He started bringing up plans for the house. "Maybe it's time to downsize," he said once too casually, while sitting across from Dad with a tablet in hand. "This place is too much for you now." Dad nodded but didn't answer. Later that night, I asked him about it. "Are you thinking of moving?" I said gently, trying not to sound accusatory. He stared at his hands. "Your brother thinks it would be easier, less upkeep. What do you think?" He didn't reply. He just closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm tired, sweetie. Let's not talk about this now." I let it go, because I was afraid of where it might lead. Weeks passed. My brother came and went. I remained. I kept the schedule paid, the bills, talked to the doctors, updated the calendar with his medications and checkups. But the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a waiting room where I was both the nurse and the patient, unacknowledged and slowly vanishing. Then one evening while dusting the hallway shelf, I opened the drawer beneath Dad's favorite frame photo, the one of us at the lake when we were kids, dripping wet, smiling into the sun. Underneath the spare batteries and expired coupons, I found something folded into thirds, thick paper, faint smell of ink. It was a will, not the official one, but a handwritten draft, Dad's script unmistakable, a little shakier than it once was, but still his. It listed me as co-owner, as caretaker, as the one who had provided constant, unwavering support over 2 decades of illness and grief. I sat down on the floor with it in my lap, heart racing. It was dated 3 years prior, before the silence, before the tablets, before the unopened envelopes and the new lawyers my brother had brought around in buttoned collars and leather shoes. It didn't make sense. Or maybe it made perfect sense. My father had intended to honor his promise. At some point, he had meant to give me my due. My brother had simply intervened. I folded the draft carefully, slid it between the pages of a cookbook no one used anymore, and closed the drawer without a sound. It was the moment something inside me shifted. I stopped making his coffee. I stopped reminding my brother about appointments. I stopped filling in the whiteboard on the fridge. I watched instead. I listened. And when my father passed not long after, and my brother delivered the news with a strangely rehearsed calm, and when I returned to this house after the funeral to be told I no longer had a right to be here, I understood. Everything that was warm in this family had died before the body. I didn't leave right away. Even after the words had landed like broken glass in my throat, I stayed in the house for 2 more nights, not because I was welcome, but because I wasn't ready to walk out of something that had taken my entire life to build. The guest room, my room, once still had the quilt Mom made in her final year. It smelled like cedar and lavender, but the corners had begun to curl. I lay on top of it, fully clothed, the first night, staring at the ceiling, listening for the old house's sounds. I counted the ticks of the hallway clock, the distant hum of the neighbor's porch, light, the shuffle of my brother's expensive shoes across the tile. He never checked on me, not once. The second morning, I stood in the backyard with a cup of black coffee and watched the wind pass through the overgrown jasmine. I had planted it 12 years ago. It was supposed to frame the fence, but it had climbed everywhere, wild, disobedient, still blooming, still fragrant. I found myself whispering, "You remembered," and I didn't know if I meant the plant or myself. That afternoon, I went into the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. The stairs groaned louder than I remembered. Dust covered everything like a thin film of memory. I found boxes marked in my father's hand, receipts, photos, deed, original copy. But when I opened the deed folder, the document inside was new, too new, crisp, professionally notarized, not his handwriting, not the signature I knew. His name was there, and then beneath it, only one other, my brother. There was no mention of me, no amendment, no explanation, no clause in fine print, just an absence deliberate and sharp, as if I had been peeled away from the paper like a Post-it note and discarded. I sat down on the floor beside a box of broken Christmas lights and cried for the first time in weeks. Not loud, not heaving, just water falling from a place I hadn't known was still wet. But I didn't cry because of the paper. I cried because somewhere along the way, my father had either been convinced, coerced, or just too tired to remember the promise he made. And I hadn't been there in that exact moment to hold his hand and say, "Don't forget me." I reached into my bag, the old brown one I'd carried for years, the one with the worn handles and hidden zipper. I still had the draft will, folded, pressed, patient. I unfolded it gently, smoothing the creases with my palm. I stared at his words, again, letting each one hit. To my daughter, who gave everything without asking for anything. The ink was still legible, a little smudged in places. He had signed it with his full name, not the quick scribble he used on delivery slips, but the careful, proper version he only wrote when something mattered. And he had dated it 3 years and 4 months before his death. That was enough. It wasn't legally binding, not alone, but it was proof of intent, of truth, of a love that had at one time chosen me. And in that attic, with the dust of a family floating in the air like old breath, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't fight him, my brother, not in court, not in front of those cousins with their averted eyes and polite condolences. But I also wouldn't leave empty-handed. I would find out what else had been left behind, what wasn't filed, what wasn't signed in triplicate. I'd find the quiet corners where love had been tucked away and forgotten. I'd gather those fragments, fold them carefully, and walk out with more than boxes. I would walk out with what he couldn't erase. The night before I left, I set the table one last time. Out of habit, really. Fork on the left, glasses rinsed and dried. The good cloth napkins folded, even though I knew no one would notice. There would be a few extended family members, maybe the neighbor who used to lend us her hedge clippers, and of course, my brother. He arrived late as expected, carrying a bottle of wine he didn't open and talking too loudly. Performing, always performing. People ate. They chatted in low voices, as if afraid to disturb the bones of the house. I smiled when necessary, nodded through the same recycled condolences. No one asked where I was staying. No one offered. They assumed, I think, that I'd already faded into some other room of my life, one that didn't include this address. But I was watching him, watching the way he kept glancing at the sideboard drawer, the one where Dad had once kept his personal papers, birth certificates, bonds, a photo of Mom that he never put on display, but always kept close. My brother had cleared it out, of course, but he hadn't burned the memory of it. After the dishes were cleared and the guests had thinned to a final few, my brother tapped his glass and stood. I'd like to say a few words, he began. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked them for being part of this journey. He used words like transition and legacy. He said, "It's time to think about what comes next for the family property." He didn't say house. He didn't say home, just property, like a parcel of land he'd never wept in. I waited. And when he sat down and lifted his glass for a toast, I reached into my bag. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I simply placed the folded draft will on the table in front of me. I looked at him directly for the first time all evening. "This is the first version," I said. "He wrote it before you brought in the lawyers." Silence. The room tensed like an inhale held too long. No one moved. My brother's smile dropped slowly, like it had finally grown tired of pretending. He reached for the paper, but I placed my hand over it. "I'm not contesting anything I said. You don't have to worry." His jaw tightened. "Then what's the point of this?" "The point," I said quietly, "is that I know, and now you do too." He looked at me, eyes flicking between fury and fear, and something else I couldn't name. He was calculating, always was trying to figure out if this was a threat, a play, a trap. It wasn't. It was a release. I slid the paper back into my bag and stood. I picked up my coat, tucked in the chair, and nodded to the two cousins who still hadn't said a word all night. And then I walked out. No grand speech, no demands, just the sound of my shoes on the tile, just the draft will in my bag, just the knowledge that I had been loved once enough to be chosen, even if the world had tried to rewrite that part. That night, I checked into a quiet inn on the outskirts of town. The woman at the front desk offered me tea, and for some reason, that small gesture made me cry harder than anything else had. I sat by the window in that tiny room, watching moths tap at the glass, and I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Certainty, not about what I would do next, but about who I no longer was. I was not the shadow of someone else's plans. I was not a name that could be erased with a pen. I was the keeper of memory, the witness to truth, and I was walking away with it intact. The next morning, I woke up with an ache in my chest. Not pain, exactly, just a kind of stillness that had weight. I sat up slowly, the hotel bed sheets tangled around my ankles, and watched the sky shift from gray to gold behind a veil of lace curtains. For the first time in days, I didn't hear anyone's voice in my head, not my father's, not my brother's, only mine. I checked out just after 7, handed the key back to the same woman with the soft smile, and got in the car. I didn't head back toward the house. I turned the other way toward the small property my father had quietly bought over a decade ago in my name. I'd almost forgotten about it. It was a modest thing, a cottage tucked behind a line of pine trees about 40 minutes out of town. He called it the retreat when he bought it. At the time, I thought it was just a tax shelter or some future investment, but now I saw it for what it was, a quiet promise. He had bought it the same year Mom died. He'd never said why, just handed me the deed and said, "If you ever need to disappear, this place will be waiting." I remember laughing at the time, but now those words echoed in my bones. The gate creaked when I pushed it open. The gravel crunched under my feet. Ivy had crept up one side of the cottage, but the lock still worked. I stepped inside and was greeted by the scent of dust and pine wood. A stack of firewood still stood in the corner, a few cobwebs in the window, but it was whole, untouched, mine. I set my bag down, the one still holding the draft will, and stood in the center of the room, hands in my pockets, not moving. There was no furniture, save for an old table and a single chair, but I didn't feel the absence of things. I felt space, breathing room, I opened the back door and stepped onto the tiny porch that faced a sloping hill. Wildflowers had taken over the yard. Bees hovered lazily in the morning light. I sat on the steps, the wood warm beneath me, and pulled out the letter again. I read it slowly, not for legality, for meaning. To my daughter who gave everything without asking for anything. I could have taken it to a lawyer, could have made a case even if the odds weren't great. I could have dragged my brother into a public mess. But I was tired. Not of fighting. I never even got the chance to fight, but of justifying my place in rooms I had built with my own hands. That cottage became my home. I cleaned it slowly over weeks, one drawer at a time. I painted the walls a soft, forgiving color. I planted jasmine again from cuttings I'd taken in secret before I left. They rooted easily. They always had. Neighbors introduced themselves, quiet folk. No one asked about family. No one asked what I had left behind. They just offered sugar when they had extra or helped lift heavy groceries from the trunk. It was enough. Sometimes I still thought about the house, the one I grew up in. I pictured the hallways, the hollow quiet my brother walking through it, like a man who had won something he didn't understand. But the anger that used to sit in my chest like a hot coal began to cool. It wasn't forgiveness. It was detachment. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need apologies. I just needed to return to myself. And I did. One morning, I found a package on my doorstep. No name, no return address. Inside was a faded photograph, me and my father in the kitchen laughing. I don't remember the moment being captured. I don't know who took it, but it was real. I hung it on the wall above the table. He had failed me in the end, but he had also tried, in his own way, in moments. Not enough to undo the damage, but enough for me to recognize that some part of him had wanted me to be okay. That was the version of him I chose to carry forward. The rest could stay buried. The first person who asked if I had lost the house said it in that hushed, cloying tone people use when they're halfway between gossip and pity. It was a woman I barely knew, someone who used to sit near me in church years ago, now seen again at the small farmer's market just outside town. She tilted her head when she asked, as if sympathy had to lean sideways to be effective. I looked at her for a long moment before replying. "No," I said. "It lost me." Her eyebrows pulled together slightly, as if the answer didn't compute. But I didn't owe her more. I didn't owe anyone more. After that, I started writing again. It wasn't anything grand, no memoirs, no declarations, just pages, longhand. Sometimes about the jasmine, other times about the stillness of the morning sky, or the way certain memories return only when you've made enough space for them. I wrote once about a time when my brother and I were children, and he got lost in the woods behind our house. I was the one who found him crying, with both his knees scraped, clutching a toy car in his hand. He never said thank you, just followed me home with his head down, and our father told me I'd done good. That was enough then. Funny how some patterns begin that early. There was peace in the small routines. I learned the best times to catch sun through the kitchen window. I figured out how to unclog the sink myself. I bought secondhand furniture one piece at a time and painted it all in tones that matched the softness I was trying to build inside myself. One day, while clearing out a stack of my old journals that I'd kept in storage, I found a letter tucked between the pages. It was from Dad. Not long, not dramatic, just 2 paragraphs scrawled in his stiff, slanted hand. "If you ever find this, I hope it's because you're still reading. You always had that kind of mind, the kind that looks for the through line. I don't know how to explain everything, but I know you were the one who stayed. That mattered more than you'll ever know. Forgive me for the things I left undone. I hope the little house gives you silence, not loneliness. I left it in your name for a reason. You always saw the roots while the rest of us stared at the leaves. I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. He hadn't been brave enough to fight for me out loud, but somewhere inside the corners of his guilt, he'd still tried to leave me a path out, a trace of belief, a quiet shelter. And somehow I had found it, not through lawsuits, not through shouting matches or cold arguments over dinner tables, but by remembering who I had always been and refusing to let anyone rewrite it. I kept that letter in the top drawer of my writing desk. I didn't frame it, I didn't quote it, but I read it once in a while, especially on the days I felt the edge of grief tugging at my sleeve again, not because it made things right, but because it reminded me that even in the quietest betrayals, there are still people, still fathers, still humans who try in their flawed ways to be good, even if they fail, especially when they fail. Summer came slowly that year, the kind of summer that arrives not with heat, but with the absence of cold. Mornings grew lighter. The wind softened. I started leaving the windows open at night, even if it meant waking up to the sounds of frogs or the occasional rustle of something wild moving through the underbrush. I didn't talk about my brother much, even to myself. I didn't need to. The silence between us had stretched so wide, so thick, it had become its own language. And yet, I'd sometimes catch a flicker of his voice in the back of my head, usually not the present-day version, but the boy who used to climb onto my bed during thunderstorms and whisper, "Do you think the house will blow away?" I always said no. We never imagined the storm would come from inside. One evening, while organizing the old filing box I had brought from Dad's study, I came across a crumpled envelope labeled transfer, pending. I almost threw it away, thinking it was a draft or duplicate, but something made me stop. Inside were scans of the first legal documents prepared to transfer the family house to both of us, equal share, dated 5 years ago. My father had signed them. My brother never had. No explanation. Just the empty signature line beneath his name. It was like a ghost that had chosen not to haunt. He had known. All those years, he had known exactly what was intended. And he had waited, delayed, outlasted, until Dad got too sick to remember, until convenience became authority. I ran my finger over the page, tracing the empty line. It struck me then, this betrayal hadn't been sudden. It had been a long erosion, like water finding the weak spot in stone. Quiet, patient, and eventually irreversible. But what broke my heart wasn't that he did it. It was that he never even tried to explain, never offered a lie, a justification, a moment of weakness, just silence, as if my absence had always been part of the plan. I folded the document and tucked it into a new envelope, one I labeled myself, the version that could have been. I didn't want revenge, but I wanted to remember, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. It's easy to romanticize, forgetting to say, let it go, as if memory is a faucet you can turn off. But I've learned that some memories aren't wounds, they're warnings, and some truths are not for shouting. They are for keeping like maps of terrain you've already crossed barefoot bleeding and still survived. Around that time, I started working with wood. It began with a shelf, something small, just for my books, but I liked the feel of it. The grain, the resistance, the clean ache in my arms after sanding. There's something healing in building something real with your hands after a lifetime of being dismissed as invisible. I made chairs, a table, refinished the kitchen counters. Each board I cut was a line drawn. This space is mine. This time is mine. This version of myself, unclaimed, unnamed by anyone else, is mine. Sometimes people from town would ask if I was okay, not out of suspicion, just curiosity. And I'd smile, gently, because I was, not happy in the way I once believed I'd be surrounded by family legacy, intact, thanked and remembered, but whole. And whole, I was starting to realize was more valuable than applause. One morning, while walking the perimeter of the property, I saw a man leaning over the fence, admiring the jasmine. "Beautiful work," he said. "Yours." "Yes," I replied. He nodded, took a long look at the house, and said, "Funny thing about roots, the deeper they go, the less they need permission." He didn't introduce himself. He didn't linger, just walked on. But I held that sentence in my mouth for hours. Afterward, turning it over like a polished stone. Maybe I hadn't been erased after all. Maybe I'd just been replanted. The letter from the lawyer arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, just my name typed cleanly. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a formality, a tax document, a leftover from Dad's estate. But when I opened it and saw the letterhead, my stomach tightened before I even read the first line. "Dear Ms. Thompson, our office has been contacted by Mr. Charles Thompson regarding the recent handling of your late father's estate. While the current deed stands as valid, Mr. Thompson has expressed concern about documents currently in your possession that may pertain to earlier revisions of the will." I stopped reading. It was a warning disguised as a request. He knew I had the original draft, or suspected. Either way, he wanted it gone, buried, forgotten. That night, I took every document I had, the original will, the transfer forms, even Dad's short letter, and laid them out across the kitchen table. I lit a candle, not for drama, but for presence. I wanted to feel like I was witnessing something sacred. I didn't burn them. I scanned them, saved copies, mailed one to a friend out of state with instructions. The originals I wrapped in plastic and sealed in a weatherproof lockbox buried under the floorboards in the shed out back. Not out of spite, just memory insurance, a way to ensure I would never again be at the mercy of someone else's narrative. I wrote a response to the lawyer, simple, polite, legal enough to be taken seriously, soft enough to stay out of court. I am in possession of documents written in my father's hand that reflect a different intent than what was filed. I have no intention of pursuing legal action at this time, but I will retain these items for my personal records. I never got a reply, but the silence that followed was louder than anything he could have written. Weeks passed, then months. My brother didn't call. I didn't expect him to. But one afternoon, as I was sweeping leaves off the porch, a car pulled up to the edge of the gravel. Black, shiny, impersonal. He didn't get out, just sat there, engine running. I watched from behind the screen door. Our eyes met for half a second, maybe less. Then he pulled away. That was the last time I saw him. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel anger. Just a small, hollow click inside, like a door, locking for the last time. After that, I let myself begin again. I joined a local book circle, planted carrots and sweet peas. I painted the spare room a pale blue and started hosting tea on Sundays for a few neighbors who'd become friends, And for the first time in a long time, I started sleeping through the night. No dreams of locked doors, no waking in the dark, wondering if I had forgotten something, lost, something left, something behind. I hadn't. Everything worth keeping was already here, in the soil, in the smell of fresh cut wood, in the whisper of jasmine brushing against the window. Sometimes people ask if I regret not fighting harder, if I feel like I gave up too easily. But they don't understand. This was never a surrender. It was an exit, a reclaiming. Because sometimes the only way to keep your dignity is to walk away while it's still yours. And I had done that, quietly, completely, and with the will in my bag, the real one, the one written in love, not law. Fall arrived like a hush. The air grew thinner, softer around the edges. Leaves curled at their tips before they turned. There was a kind of elegance in their surrender, not a collapse, but a graceful yielding. I walked the perimeter of the property each morning with a mug of tea, my boots brushing against the dew-wet grass, and I started to notice how different solitude felt now. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't exile. It was a homecoming I hadn't expected. One afternoon, while digging up the last of the summer's root vegetables, I unearthed a glass marble blue, and green cracked slightly in the center. It was one of my brother's. He used to carry them around in a sock when we were kids, saying they were dragon eyes. I held it between my thumb and forefinger, watching how the light caught inside. It fractured and strange. I didn't know what to do with it at first. Then I placed it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, next to the small jar of rosemary and the chipped mug I used for flower clippings. A reminder, not of him exactly, but of what once was. A time before the fractures, when we still shared a language. Memory doesn't always have to be bitter, to be honest. That same week, I received an invitation in the mail. My cousin Elaine was getting married, a late-in-life love story that had bloomed unexpectedly, and she wanted me there. I hadn't seen her since the funeral. She wrote a note in the card, "I know things have been hard, but if anyone deserves a little joy, it's you." I thought about not going, about staying tucked in, the quiet safety I'd built. But something in me wanted to be seen again, not as a ghost of what happened, but as someone still alive. So I went. I wore the dark green dress my mother once complimented, even though it was out of season. I let my hair down. I smiled when I arrived, let people hug me, even the ones who hadn't known what to say at the funeral and said nothing at all. The ceremony was short, sweet, the kind of thing that makes you believe for a moment that maybe love can happen cleanly, even after years of damage. At the reception, my cousin pulled me aside. "I heard what happened," she said quietly, eyes scanning mine for permission to continue. "With the house, with Charles." I didn't answer, but I didn't look away. She nodded. "Just so you know, a few of us knew. We didn't know how to help." I let that sit between us. The weight of bystanders. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. "Not anymore." "You should have fought harder," she whispered. "No," I said. "I just stopped fighting where I was never going to win." She blinked, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "You always had more spine than the rest of us. We thought you'd, I don't know, burn it all down." "I did," I said, sipping my wine, "just not in the way you think. I left early before the cake, before the dancing." The road home was quiet, the stars sharper than usual, and as I pulled up to my cottage porch, light glowing like a beacon, I felt something uncoil in my chest. Not triumph, not justice, but freedom. I was no longer the woman who waited for someone to say, "I'm sorry." I was no longer the sister hoping for reconciliation. I was no longer the daughter who needed proof that her love had mattered. I was simply myself, unclaimed, unwritten, unfolding. I stopped checking the mailbox for his letters. For a while, I think I still hoped he might send one, not an apology, exactly, but some acknowledgement, a scrap of shared memory, something that said, "I know what I did, and I know who you are." But weeks turned to months, and silence is a patient companion. It stretches until it becomes furniture, familiar, unremarkable. So I stopped waiting. Instead, I built new rhythms. I joined a community woodshop class, mostly retirees, and 2 younger women who sold carved kitchen utensils at the market. I told them I was just learning, but they called me natural. I laughed the first time, not because I doubted them, but because no one had called me anything but responsible or quiet or dependable in years. Natural felt like a name, given, not inherited. We met on Saturdays, made spoons, stools a birdhouse, shaped like a teacup. It sounds silly, maybe, but there was something holy about it, turning raw wood into something whole with your hands, without asking anyone for permission. I started selling pieces at the co-op down the road. I never signed my full name, just E. That was enough. Those who bought them didn't need the story behind the knots in the grain. Occasionally, someone would ask where I lived, and I'd point vaguely past the hill. "Out near the pines," I'd say. No one asked more. One morning in late October, I walked into town to buy canning jars and overheard 2 women at the cafe counter. "You hear about the Thompson house?" My ears pricked. "They've listed it," one said. "Charles is finally selling. Market's up." I paused, coffee half lifted. The other woman shook her head. "Shame. That house has stories." They went on drifting into talk of renovations and square footage. I stood still for a long moment, the weight of their words settling over me. So he was selling it. Our house, my house, the one I'd painted walls and cleaned vomit from carpets in, laid our mother to rest in. I didn't feel anger or grief. I felt absence, but not the kind that wounds, the kind that frees. I walked home slower that day, let the wind push against my coat, let the leaves fall without catching them. When I got home, I stood at the edge of my own fence, the one I'd painted blue in the summer, and I looked at the place I had chosen, the one that had not been taken from me, but earned by 1,000 quiet decisions. I pulled out my phone and opened a folder titled Proof. Inside were photos of the will of Dad's letter, of the land deed, with my name of the draft, with his handwritten addendum, and I deleted them one by one. Not because I didn't still believe in what they meant, but because I didn't need them anymore to believe in what I'd become. That night I slept with the windows open. The jasmine had started blooming again, even though it was late in the season. Some things, I've learned, bloom out of order, out of defiance, out of a refusal to be told when they're allowed to be beautiful. So I let them. I let myself. Winter came without drama. No storms, no ice. Just a quiet thinning of the air and the soft settling of cold into the bones of the house. I didn't decorate for the holidays, not because I was sad, but because there was no one to perform for. No guests, no children visiting, no expectation to be merry. And in the space left behind by tradition, I found something gentler stillness. I wrapped the porch rails with old wool scarves instead of lights, lit beeswax candles in the evening, played instrumental records, and cooked soup that lasted for days. No one dropped by, no one called, and for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't echo. It rested. One morning I walked down to the small mailbox by the road and found a letter postmarked from the city. No return name, just an address I didn't recognize. The handwriting was oddly familiar, careful, deliberate, slightly slanted. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just a sentence. I found the other will. You were right. I don't expect you to forgive me. There was no anger in me when I read it. No triumph either. Just a soft exhale, the kind that escapes before you know it's there. He had found it. Whether by accident or design, he had unearthed the piece of paper that for years he had pretended didn't exist. He had seen it with his own eyes, the version of our father that had tried to do right. And now, the weight of that truth was his alone to carry. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside the sink. Not in a folder, not in a lockbox, just among the ordinary things: scissors, takeout menus, spare batteries. Let it live where real life did. That afternoon, I took a long walk through the fields behind the cottage. The frost was just beginning to kiss the tips of the grass. The air stung in a way that reminded me I was still alive. I stood at the crest of the hill and watched a line of birds move across the sky in perfect silence. And for a moment, I let myself say his name out loud, not with rage, not with longing, just acknowledgement. Charles. The name hung there cold and light. I remembered us as children, building snow forts in the backyard, daring each other to run barefoot in the snow. I remembered how he once made me a paper crown and declared me queen of the pine cones. That boy was gone, but he had existed, and maybe somewhere inside, the man who wrote that letter, a sliver of that boy, had survived enough to see the truth and put it on paper. That was something. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. Forgiveness isn't always an exchange. Sometimes it's simply a release, like opening your palm and letting the weight fall out. I walked back home in the quiet boots, leaving clean tracks behind me. At the door, the jasmine vine had turned brittle with the cold, its leaves curled inward like hands in prayer. I reached out, touched the stem gently. Rest, I whispered, not sure if I meant it, for the plant, for my brother, or for myself, maybe all of us. It was in early spring, when the soil had just started to loosen and the birds returned, like quiet messengers, that I heard a knock on my door. A real one, not the imagined echo of guilt, not the memory of someone arriving too late, a steady human knock. I froze in the kitchen, my hands deep in a bowl of dough heart, suddenly thudding louder than reason. I hadn't had a visitor in weeks. When I opened the door, there he was, Charles, standing on my porch, like he didn't remember how it once felt to walk through my front door without asking. His coat looked too heavy for the weather, or maybe it was just the way he held himself, as if weighted from the inside. He didn't smile, didn't pretend. "Can I come in?" he asked. I didn't answer. I stepped aside. The house was quiet, except for the ticking clock and the soft sound of rain beginning to tap at the gutters. He stood in the doorway like a man at confession, not knowing where to begin. "I didn't think you'd ever speak to me again," he said finally. I looked at him. I didn't say I was going to speak. That surprised him, but he nodded, accepted it. For once, he didn't try to lead the conversation. He took a seat at the edge of the couch, careful not to touch anything. I remained standing. He looked around the room, at the shelf I'd built, the photos on the wall, the old table I'd sanded down and repainted. I didn't expect this place to feel like you, he said softly. It's me, I replied. This is what's left when no one's writing over you. He swallowed hard. I came because I wanted to tell you that I've sold the house, the one on Maple Street. I nodded once. I heard. I didn't keep the money, he added. I put most of it into a trust for hospice care, for women who, he paused, who do the work you did when there's no one else. Something shifted in my spine. I didn't know if it was forgiveness or the faint suggestion of it. I should have said something years ago, he continued, but every time I thought about it, I convinced myself that what I did wasn't that bad, that you'd moved on, that you didn't need anything. I didn't need anything, I said. That's why it hurt. He looked down at his hands. I found Dad's letter, the one he wrote you. My mouth went dry. I hadn't told anyone about that letter. I had assumed it was private, buried among the journals he never opened. He mentioned the cottage, he said it was yours from the beginning. I think I always knew that. I just didn't want to believe he would give you something and not me. You already had everything, I said, quieter than I meant to. He nodded, slowly. I know that now. A long silence settled between us, full but not hostile. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. I could smell the faint scent of rosemary from the pot on the stove. He stood up gently. I won't stay, he said. I just wanted you to hear it from me, that I know, that I'm sorry, and that if you ever... He stopped himself. No, never mind. He turned to leave. At the door, I said his name. He paused. You did wrong, I said, and you knew it. He nodded again. I did. And I don't forgive you, I said. Not yet. I don't expect you to. But I don't hate you either, I added, and that part surprised even me. He turned back, eyes full, not of hope, but of something more grounded. Understanding, maybe, or grief. I'm glad you built this life, he said, even if it had to be without us. It didn't have to be, I said, but it is. Then he left. I stood at the door for a long time after he was gone, not crying, not shaking, just present. I'd expected that moment to feel like an ending, but it didn't. It felt like a comma. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the property. Again, a habit, now like brushing my teeth or steeping my tea just long enough for the bitterness to soften. The dew was heavy, the ground spongy underfoot, and the air had that rare kind of clarity you only get after a night of honest rain. I paused at the fence line where I'd once buried the lockbox, the one holding the documents that could have changed everything. I hadn't touched it since that day, hadn't even thought about digging it up, though I knew exactly where it was, under the jasmine, where the roots now wound protectively around it like a secret. But something in me had shifted since Charles's visit. It wasn't resolution, not peace exactly, but a kind of acceptance that didn't demand closure, like finding a splinter you once thought had healed and realizing it never did, but it also no longer hurt. Back inside, I pulled out the small box of letters I'd written but never sent. Some were to my father, drafted late at night in the first months after he passed. Some were to my brother, full of words I could never say in person, raw and unfinished. And a few were just to no one, outlets for all the heat that had no safe place to land. I burned them that afternoon, one by one, in the fireplace. No ceremony, no photographs, just flame and ash and silence. I watched the paper curl in on itself, watched the ink disappear, watched the last of those unsent thoughts turn into air, and then I opened the windows, let the smoke drift out like breath finally exhaled. There's something cleansing about choosing to release what you no longer need, not because you've been told to let go, but because you finally can. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself, really cooked. Roasted sweet potatoes with thyme from the garden, a lentil stew, fresh bread warm from the oven. I set the table for one and poured a single glass of red wine. I ate slowly, without distraction, without regret. Afterward, I sat on the porch and wrote in my journal. Today, I spoke to no one, but I felt surrounded, not by ghosts, by what they left behind. I have stories in my bones. I have peace in my breath. I am not waiting for anyone to call my name anymore. There was a freedom in that, not lonely, just alone. And I finally understood the difference. Later that night, as I was preparing for bed, I passed the mirror in the hallway. I stopped, not to adjust anything, not out of vanity, just to look. I stared at my own face, lined, yes, softer in places, but not fragile. I traced the outline of my jaw with my fingers, brushed a stray hair from my forehead, and I smiled, not big, not theatrical, just enough to recognize myself again. The woman in the mirror wasn't the one who had been erased from a deed. She wasn't the one who'd been forgotten or rewritten or pushed aside. She was the one who had walked away without slamming the door. And that made her powerful. The days that followed took on a kind of quiet rhythm, not the monotony of survival, but the grace of something earned. I tended the garden. I read through my father's old notebooks, the ones he never shared, filled with half-started thoughts and observations scribbled in the margins of bills and crossword puzzles. He had always wanted to be a writer. I never knew that. One entry stayed with me. She sees things I don't. Maybe that's what makes her dangerous and necessary. No date, no context. But I knew it was about me. I folded that page and kept it tucked in the back of my wallet next to the photo of us at the lake when we were small. Not to prove anything, just to remember that even in his silence, there were words he meant for me. In town, I became known not as the woman who lost the house, but as the woman with the jasmine. That's how the local newspaper described me when they ran a feature on the co-op. They took photos of my carved bowls, my hand-painted chairs, my rosemary soap wrapped in linen. I declined to be interviewed. I didn't need my voice printed in ink. It was already in every line I'd sanded smooth. One afternoon, a teenager showed up at my gate, holding a half-finished birdhouse and looking like someone had dared him to knock. "You teach woodworking?" he asked. I replied. He showed up every week after that. Then another girl came, and then 3 more. I didn't plan to start a class, but one formed anyway. In the back shed, with open windows and the smell of sawdust and citrus oil. No grades, no lectures. Just hands learning what it feels like to make something real. Sometimes they'd ask me questions about my life, about the past. I never lied, but I didn't elaborate. I told them just enough to show that survival wasn't the same as silence. "Were you ever married?" one girl asked while sanding a stool leg. "No," I said. "I stayed for other people instead." She nodded, didn't ask more. That night, I walked the edge of the garden and thought about what I would have said if I'd been younger. If I'd believed then what I know now, that a woman doesn't need a title or a house deed to have authority. She only needs her name, her voice, her story. I'd given mine away once, but not anymore. In early May, I received a letter from the hospice trust my brother had funded. They had named a new wing in our father's memory. They had also listed me as an anonymous donor per his request. I stared at that line for a long time. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't justice, but it was, perhaps, a final attempt at acknowledgement. I didn't attend the ceremony. I stayed home, watched the bees return to the rosemary, repainted the kitchen door, bought myself a pair of leather gloves I'd admired all winter, but hadn't let myself splurge on. Because I could. Because no one could tell me not to. That night, I made jasmine tea and wrote 2 lines in my journal. I was never asking for the house. I just wanted to be seen as someone who belonged. I closed the journal and went to bed with the windows open, the wind breathing gently through the curtains. And I slept soundly, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped trying to be resolved by someone else's terms. I belonged, not to a deed, not to a family myth, to myself. Some stories don't end with a door slamming or a courtroom win. Some stories end the way breath leaves the body after a long sigh, slow, full, unceremonious. The house I lost still stands, but it no longer calls my name. The people who turned away have stayed turned, and that's all right. There's a strange kind of peace in not being needed anymore, in not offering more than you should. This little cottage, with its uneven floorboards and wild jasmine, holds everything I was never given space, quiet, and permission. No one decides what I plant here. No one rewrites my name on the land I tend. What I lost was never the bricks, the keys, the title. What I lost was the illusion that love always protects. What I found, what I built with my own 2 hands, is the kind of strength no paper can validate, no brother can revoke, and no absence can erase. I'm not bitter. I'm not waiting. I'm here. And that finally is enough. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if this story moved you. Share your voice. It matters.